you all this first question. Could the debt crisis in the Eurozone trigger a new collapse in the global financial system? Owen Stelzer.
Well, the bad news is, of course, that it could. The good news is that it doesn't necessarily have to. Tim Geithner popped over to London to advise Europe how to follow the kinds of programs that he and others here have pushed that have gotten us back from the brink. Those are available to Europe, but the cumbersome governing process in Europe, the lack of central control of fiscal policy, and the long-term impediments to growth in Europe all are big worries. But the good news is people created them, people can solve them.
Emma Bonino, so the US Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, some concerns there. What do you think? Could we be seeing a new global financial crisis?
I do think there are still concerns, but it's also true that Europe, it's cumbersome, I agree, but it's also true that when when member states feel that it's a real emergency, they can act very quickly. Imagine that they changed the treaty during one night, and they bypassed basically the famous no bailout clause. So the fact is that I don't think we are totally sure that we are out of the problem, but I see that, for instance, now member states are all rushing to new budget with fiscal authority. And so, I mean, the dynamic started with the emergency stabilization scheme is continuing.
We'll come to the remedies in a moment, but let's just stick with this first question. Philippe Legrain, where do you stand on this new big crisis all over the world?
Well, I agree with Erwin that, you know, it could potentially spark a much wider crisis, but it need not with appropriate government policies, and so long as panic doesn't take root. I mean, the underlying problems are, you know, excessive debts, both private and government, their uncertain growth prospects. And then combined on top of that, you have had in recent weeks a return of some of the panic that we saw after Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008. And that's the most worrying aspect of this. I think that the focus on the Eurozone, though, is very misplaced. I mean, this debt crisis started off in Dubai. It then moved to Greece, which has its own particular worries. And then traders lumped together countries which actually have very little in common, the so-called pigs.
I mean, is that really the case? I'll throw this to any one of you, Owen Stelzer perhaps. I mean, the Royal Bank of Scotland this week has said quite simply that $2.5 trillion of debt issued by governments and companies in Greece, Spain and Portugal is held by financial institutions in the rest of the world outside of those countries. And so clearly the finances of the Eurozone are interconnected to the rest of the world.
I don't think Philippe was denying that. I think he was saying that countries have very different circumstances, but nevertheless, there is a link. The link is through the banking system, through the financial system, and you notice that if the solution to Europe's problems is to be handled by ignoring the treaty that everybody has signed, I'm not very hopeful that that is a long-run solution that's viable in democratic countries.
Emma Bonino?
No, I do agree that interconnection is such that nobody can be saved on his own. But it's also true that up to now, some member states in Europe did not abide to the rules. And that is one of the real shortcomings in Europe, in the sense that the European institutions, up to now, they do not have enough intrusive power, let's say, in the economic and budget of member states. That is what has to be overcome.
Philippe Legrain, I mean, is there a possibility, I mean, this is what could happen, that Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, all massively in debt, and because the banks in the Eurozone are exposed to their debt, if their credit worthiness is being called into question, which it is, you really have to worry whether these countries can actually repay their debts.
You need to worry. You need to distinguish between solvency problems, and I agree that in Greece's case, it's highly debatable whether Greece can repay its debts, and why personally I think that Greece should have called in the IMF and it should have restructured its debts, i.e., agreed to pay back less than full value, which incidentally would have prevented this second outrageous bailout of European banks and thus prevented even greater risk-taking by banks in future. But it's simply not true. Spain has a lower level of government debt than Germany does. The EU overall has a lower level of government debt than the US does. The next victim of this could just as well be the United Kingdom, with a run on the pound and spiking
So should we be worried or should
yields.
we not?
No, well, we should be worried, but I think the focus on looking at this entirely from a Euro perspective, or following the German line, this is all about fiscal stability rules and so on, I think actually is completely misleading and missing the wider picture.
Owen Stelzer, I mean,
Well,
yeah, sorry.
That's okay. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, think about France, for instance, which we think of as the rich northern country. It's running a debt ratio of 8% of GDP. That's not chopped liver. So I think Philippe is right. There is we have over-leveraged the public and private sectors in the world. Well, not in the world, but in most developed countries. And we are going to have to deleverage them. That is going to be a very painful process, but it need not be a calamity if it's handled properly and in the long run if we remove impediments to growth. I mean, in the end, you can't cut enough to get out of this problem unless at the same time we have reasonable economic growth in Europe, in America, in Japan, and I guess in Britain, which some people consider part of Europe.
All right, Emma Bonino, the same point to you then. Do you think, how justified are worries that some countries in Europe, including Britain outside of the Eurozone, may not be able to repay its debts?
Well, that is a concern, and I agree with what has been said, but I would like to point out that the only possibility is not only fiscal austerity, but growth. And what is lacking up to now, both in the national budget and it seems to me even in the proposal of the Commission, is exactly how you promote growth. For instance, in my country, the budget, the austerity package, is cuts in public spending, which is all right, but there is nothing on structural reform. So the fragile growth that we are seeing is not sustained, and that is what